Today we're going to be learning Ketubot daf chet, a really interesting daf. I mentioned it's a very basic daf because it's the whole beginning of Ketubot, other than the bitulim and all that, has to do with this idea of this comparison between avelut and marriage, which is really, really, really interesting. There's a lot that one can take. In other words, again, not during shiur, but take what you're learning and think about it and do the comparison and all that. It's really, really interesting. And this is the most basic daf that includes that. Okay, today's daf is sponsored in loving memory of Rosalind Pinalis, who passed away this week. Rosalind loved family, Torah, and Israel, and was a champion of chesed and the driving force behind women's Torah study in her community, dearly missed and remembered. Today's daf is sponsored by Rena Baumer, with gratitude to Rabbanit Michelle, Maggie, Mimi, and the wonderful women of the Hadran community, my worldwide virtual chavruta. Okay, we're going to get started with the bottom. We're going to reread the end of yesterday's daf, which we kind of ran through. And I want to just talk for a minute before we move on from it, because it's really interesting. And I have to correct something I said yesterday that I missaid. So it's really important. Okay, Tano Rabbanan, and it has to do with this line. You say the brachot chatanim with 10 people, all 7 days, meaning if you have 10 people, you say the sheva brachot, which we saw already, Amar Rav Yehuda b'hu shabau panim chadashot. Okay, only if you have new people who come. So the first thing I have to correct is I mentioned we had this wedding without a minion of men, or right, there weren't even women there. There was nobody there. Anyway, what I wanted to point out is something really important. We did not say sheva brachot. That you can have a wedding without a minion. You can't have sheva brachot without a minion. That's really important. Okay, I just miss. This is a good example of misremembering, right? I remember that we had this wedding, so I was thinking, but obviously you can't have sheva brachot. That's clear from here. You need 10 people. So I asked my husband, because it was a really long time ago. It must have been over 20 years ago. And I remember I was living in a different place, and I remember it well, because it was very odd to have this one, this couple, and it was just us and them basically. So what he said is, what did we do? He said that Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva, that if you ever have a situation like this, you read from the Rambam, the brachot chatanim, as if you're learning, so it has a semblance of saying the brachot, but you're really learning it. So you can learn it, as if you're learning it, but it has the semblance of actually being the sheva brachot. So you don't actually say them. You kind of read them as if you're learning, which is what we're going to do today. So if anyone here is in the middle of getting married and you're listening to this, maybe you can use it as your sheva brachot. Okay. In any case, the other thing I wanted to discuss was panim chadashot. We didn't really have time at the end of class. So now, hu shabau panim chadashot. Why do you need panim chadashot? And what's really interesting, you've probably never heard of panim chadashot by avelim, but we're going to see about that today also. Because what does panim chadashot do? Panim chadashot, whether it be in a wedding or whether it be in a house of avelut, it brings up again all the memories, or all, right, the feelings, whether it's the happiness of the wedding, the memories in the avel. So you end up with new person walks in the door, right? It's very easy to think about this when it talks about avelut, right? It's exactly what Shiva calls it for. Someone who comes in, all of a sudden, you start the story again, you start remembering, you connect them with the person. Same thing at a wedding. New people come, you're so happy to be celebrating with new people. That's what causes you to have this extra, to say the brachot again. You don't say the brachot, okay, and I'm going to read Tosfot very quickly. At the bottom of the daf, Omer Ri, the Ri says, the panim chadashot ain't korei ele b'bnei adam shemarbim b'shvilam simcha yoter. Panim chadashot are there because they add extra simcha to them. B'Shabbat dechashvin panim chadashot. Tamrina ba'agada mizmor shel yom Shabbat. Now we're going to get to why Shabbat. Someone said at the end of class yesterday, right? Why Shabbat? Do you not need panim chadashot? Because Shabbat itself is panim chadashot. Now you understand what that means. Because what does it mean? It means we're adding an added element of simcha. So he comes and he explains. The Agada says, there's a midrash about mizmor shiur yom Shabbat. Why do we have a special shiur for yom Shabbat? Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu panim chadashot ba'u lekam. We sing because it's this exciting simcha, right? You talk about the feeling you have when you say Kabbalat Shabbat, right? It's this exciting feeling that Shabbat is coming. Nomar shira, and therefore we sing shira. Hatam nami marbim lechvod Shabbat b'simcha v'seudah. Shabbat itself has added simcha. So therefore, since it had this added element of simcha, so therefore we basically say you don't need anything additional. Okay, the Shabbat itself is misamech. My mevarech. So now the question is, what are the sheva brachot? And you're going to see right now, they're not actually sheva brachot. I want you to notice in the Gemara, they don't call it sheva brachot. I didn't look, but it would be interesting to see when they started calling them sheva brachot. We're going to see there's a debate, is it 5 or 6? How we get to 7? Because they add borei priagafen, and borei priagafen counts as one of the 7. Okay, so now, what do you make the brachot? What brachot? And it's a little bit weird because theoretically there should be one blessing. So today we're going to see why. Now we're brachot erusim. We finished it yesterday about what type of brachot erusim. Is it a brachot mitzvah or is it a brachot sheva? Brachot praising God. These are clearly brachot sheva. Okay, they're blessings of praise to God about various different things, and that's why we're going to have a lot of them. Notice, you probably noticed this if you ever pay attention to sheva brachot. Some are just Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, like Yotzer Ha'adam or Shakol Bara L'Chvodo. Some start with the text and end with a blessing. Some start with a blessing and end with a blessing. Normally, the rules are if you're having a blessing next to another blessing, you don't need to start with Baruch, okay? Because you already have that from the previous one. So you just need to end with Baruch, okay? Now, so we're going to have a question with why, in like for example, the last bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Asher Baras Hasam B'Simcha, starts with Baruch and ends with Baruch, which is very strange. Okay, I'm going to raise it as a question later on the daf. We're actually going to find the answer to that question. So let's get started, and then we'll try to figure out right why some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, some of them right. They're all different kinds. We won't necessarily get to all the answers, but some. So Rabbi Yehuda explained. Here's the nusach, and again, this is like a brachot sugya where we say, okay, what blessing do you say for what? Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Shakol Bara L'Chvodo. And everything was created for the glory of God. V'Yotzer Ha'adam. The next one is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Yotzer Ha'adam. God created man. V'Asher Yatzaret Ha'adam B'Tzalmo. Bracha number 3. Created God and man in His image. B'Tselem Demut Tavnito. Right, the image of God. V'Yitkin Lo Mimenu Binyan De'ad. And God then created woman. Right, a way for God to be able to be boneh. Right, to create. Forever. Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzer Ha'adam. Notice that bracha number 2 and bracha number 3 end with the exact same words, which is seemingly a little bit strange. Now we switch to a different type of bracha. This is about Yerusha. So we started with a blessing that everything was created for God's glory. We'll get back to that, what exactly that bracha is about. Then I want to read it all, and then I'm going to read Rashi with you, who gives a good explanation of a bunch of things here. Then we get to we want to have simcha in Yerushalayim. So we're talking about basically the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So Mesamech Tzion Bivanea, the focus on Jerusalem. Samech T'samach Re'im Ahuvim K'samech HaYitzircha B'Gan Eden Mikedem Baruch Atah Hashem Mesamech Chatan V'Kala. Okay, now we get to the happiness between the Chatan and the Kala. And then we have a bracha which seemingly is very similar to the previous one, but it kind of combines a few different ideas. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Asher Baras Hasam Simcha, that God created happiness. Chatan V'Kala, the rejoicing of the bride and groom. Gila Rina Ditzach Chedva Avava Yachva V'Shalom V'Re'ut. 8 words describing happiness and togetherness and peace and all that, love. Me'era Hashem Elokeinu Yishama Ba'arei Yehuda B'chutzot Yerushalayim. This kind of combines the previous 2, right? We have Jerusalem, we have Chatan and Kala, and now we get the ultimate redemption. We'll have, right, the sounds of the Chatan and Kala in the streets of Jerusalem. Kol sasam v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala, kol matzalot chatanim mechupatam u'na'alim mimishten neginatam. You're going to hear the happiness of the chatan coming out of their chuppah, and the na'arim coming from their celebration. Baruch Atah Hashem Mesamech Chatan Ima Kala, instead of Chatan V'Kala, Chatan Ima Kala. There's a lot to be said about all these things. We're not going to get into it all here. So if you look at Rashi, okay, starting from Aval. Okay, mine, it's bolded. I don't know if it's bolded in yours. It's about 15 lines or 13 lines from the top. Aval shakol bara l'chvodo einam min haseder. So first, Rashi says, the first bracha is different from all the rest. Okay, so later we'll see also the last bracha is a little bit different from all the rest. The first bracha is different from all the rest. Why? What's the first bracha for? Shakol bara l'chvodo. What's this blessing? Ela la'asefat ha'am ha'nesafim sham ligmor chesed. Basically, they view people going to a wedding as doing chesed. Okay, if you're thinking about, I'm going to the wedding for my own sake to enjoy, no, you're really doing a chesed because you're making the chatan and kala happy. And here's a bracha that's basically about the gathering of everybody at the wedding. And to say, wow, everything's for the glory of God, and how amazing all these people who are going to chesed. It's a blessing for the people who come to the wedding. they connected a little bit, right, to the fact that God did chesed for Adam HaRishon shenasa lo shishbanim v'nitasek bo. Right, basically when Adam married Chava, there was nobody around to celebrate with him, so God himself basically did that. Okay, so us gathering together is like God at the wedding of Adam and Chava. Okay, and that's why we have this bracha, to which the Gemara, the Rashi says, really, as soon as people get together, you should say that blessing, meaning the beginning of the wedding. Now, don't wait till sheva brachot. He's kikul sadra alav, just like we do at Havdalah. We have bisamim. You want to smell the bisamim. You see the light, each for different reasons. Not really connected with Havdalah, connected with Shabbat ending, but not necessarily Havdalah. But since Havdalah is done on a cup of wine, therefore we put all the blessings together. Likewise here, we're having a cup of wine under the chuppah, so we put all the blessings together. But really, that one stands somewhat separate and could theoretically be said earlier. We don't because of this issue of the cup, but in a theoretical manner, it could be. Then we have, let's just skip down. Right, then he says, right, and then it's just one hoda'ah, and that's why it doesn't have a bracha at the end. It's more like a bracha of parrot and a bracha of mitzvah. Which was because of Adam HaRishon. Okay, we're going to skip that because that's going to be in the Gemara. Okay, fine. We'll skip Rashi on the rest. I wanted to point out this issue of it being separate. So again, we have one for the people at the wedding, which is a little bit separate, could theoretically have been said earlier. Then we have the others, which are, again, creation of Adam and Chava, which makes sense because we're at a wedding and the whole thing is the union of man and wife. Then the Yerushalayim, because we have to mention Yerushalayim. And then we get to the Chatan and Kala brachot, which we have two, right? Question why we have two. Again, maybe one combines Jerusalem and there. Again, there's all sorts of theories about this. Okay, now we're going to see some stories that happen and some different, really through that, a debate. Levi ikla lebe Rebbe. Levi comes to the house of Rebbe, b'hilula de Rabbi Shimon b'rei, for the celebration of Rabbi Shimon, his son. Baruch Chamesh, he only blessed 5 out of 6. Remember, we're not talking about Borei Peragafen, so we're going to see he only blessed 5. And Rav Asi, Rav Ashi, b'hilula de Mar b'rei, Rav Asi got to the house of Rav Ashi in his celebration of Mar, his son, Baruch Shit, he said 6. So the question is, what's this debate, 6 or 5, and which is the one there's a debate about? Lema b'haka mifrege. Clearly, to the Gemara, the debate was about Yotzer HaAdam, because there's 2 brachot Yotzer HaAdam. Why do we need 2? So let's suggest that this is the machloket. Demar savar chad yitzira havai, umar savar shtei yitzirot havai. We know that there's 2 descriptions of creation of man and woman, right? One where it says zachar u'nekeva b'ra'am, as if they were created together at the same time. And one is this whole story, right, that Adam goes to sleep, God takes the selah, however you describe what that is, right, rib from his tail, and creates Chava from there. So were they created separately or together? If they're created separately, it makes sense to have 2 brachot. If they were created together, one bracha. And then and there's a machloket, we actually saw this, I can't remember what the sugi was. Let me just see if it's quoted here. I don't know, but we saw it, that there's a machloket, exactly this. Were they created shnei partzufim, kind of like a 2-faced person, and then they were split? Or were they created in stages? And it's this big contradiction of the psukim and questions about how to resolve it. So now they say, so that must be the machloket. And then you'd say the 1 bracha, because they were created at the same time, or 2 brachot, because they were created separately. To which, and I don't know why the Gemara insists on this, but the Gemara insists that that's not the machloket, and it's clear what it is. And here again, we get to material that I find hard to understand what exactly is, how to understand this and what to make of it. Again, the whole contradiction is difficult in the Torah itself. So it's a contradiction and it's a challenge how to understand it. Right? There's the famous of Rav Soloveitchik, where he talks about Adam 1 and Adam 2 and 2 different purposes of creation, 2 different purposes of marriage. Recommended reading if you haven't ever seen that. Anyway, Gemara rejects and says, Lo, tekule amachad yitzira havan. Everyone agrees, and why they choose this one, I don't know, but that they were both created at the same time. So why the 2 different descriptions in the Torah? Mar savar batar machshava azlinan, umar savar batar ma'aseh azlinan. There's what God wanted to do, which was create man, and then from man, create a woman. And then there's what God actually did in the end, which is he didn't do it like that. Now what? God changes his mind, right? Again, this is something I find hard to understand. What this resolution is, that God thought to do one thing, changed his mind, why, right? And then why are both described in the text. And here you see, by the way, if you want to connect it to in general Gemara learning, we often ask, why do we bother learning things that we don't actually do in the end, right? There's a good example. We learn, like the Torah tells you what God wanted to do, even though God didn't do it in the end, because you learned something from that. In other words, in the end, God had to create them either one way or the other, right? So why are there two descriptions? So one must have been what God wanted to do, and then there's what God did in the end. Now, why God wanted to do something one way, didn't do it that way is a good question. Anyway, this is a lot of food for thought. Okay, so we're now going to say that's machloket. How do we get to this? Well, ki had Rav Yehuda Rami. Rav Yehuda brought a contradiction between the psukim. K'tiv vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, which sounds like ha'adam, just Adam, one singular, which is a little bit weird. They chose this pasuk because the continuation of that pasuk says zachar nekeva bara'am. Okay, so it's a little bit of a question. Sorry, there's zachar nekeva bara'otam. This is in Breshit Aleph, pasuk Kav Zayin. I don't know why they didn't bring the description in Breshit Bet. It's a good question. And uktiv zacharu nekeva bera'am, which is from chapter 5, which seems to indicate they were created together. So, right, either in a separate, whatever, as one or as two separate from the first pasuk. Ha-ketzad, so how does this contradiction work? B'tchila ala b'machshava libarot shnayim, ulebasof nivra achat. And that's how Rav Yehuda resolved the contradiction, and that's how we're going to resolve this machloket here. So 5 or 6 is depending on whether, now here it's also very interesting. If you assume the machloket is not what they suggest in the beginning, what actually happened? Was it this way? Was it that way? But you say the machloket is what God thought versus what God did. So now it's a little bit interesting. One opinion would say, let's do it by what God thought and not by what God actually did, which is interesting why you would choose that and not go by what God did, which again shows that your thoughts are very significant, even if you don't necessarily act upon them. Rav Ashi ikla lebe Rav Kahana. So now we're going to have a story. Rav Ashi comes to the house of Rav Kahana. Yoma kama barech kulu. Now we're moving on topics a little bit. Still in the sheva brachot. The question is, when do you say what brachot? So the first day he said all sheva brachot. Mikam ba'elach, and this is what we saw already at the bottom of the previous stuff. If there's panim chadashot, you say all the brachot after the first day. And if not, then afusha simcha ba'alma, it's just adding on simcha. By the way, there's a whole debate. What counts as panim chadashot? Is it people who weren't at the chuppah? Is it people who weren't at the party? Is it like what exactly? What if someone was a part of the wedding, but not the whole wedding? Does that, depending on which part, does that count? Can they be panim chadashot later? It's an interesting question. So now I'm not getting, that's a halachic question that comes up later. I'm not going to get into that, but know that there's a debate about it. Okay, so now they say, so now if it's a fusha simcha ba'almahu, you're just adding, it's just, right, if you have a wedding celebration with the same people every night, so you're adding a little simcha, you're having more celebrations, but it's really just the same kind of simcha, you're adding a little bit more, that doesn't necessitate brachot. And then what do you do? What do you say? What's simcha b'mono? That's a special zimun nusach that you use. Special zimun nusach you use, which we'll see exactly when you use that. But here it says all the rest of the week of sheva brachot, you use that nusach and mention even if you don't have a minyan. And now we're going to get our answer why Asher Bara starts with Baruch and ends with Baruch. Asher Bara. Asher Bara stood as a standalone blessing if you don't have panim chadashot. Okay, we no longer do that, or at least I haven't seen it. Maybe there are people who still have the custom to do this. But Asher Bara here is used as its own separate blessing. It's standalone, and that's why it needs to start with Baruch and end with Baruch. When you say it at the chuppah, you don't necessarily need it, but since it's a standalone blessing that you say other times on its own, therefore it starts with Baruch and ends with Baruch. So that's the first 7 days. So again, very clear. First 7 days, you say sheva brachot if you have a minyan and if you have new faces. If not, you just and you say shasimcha b'mono. If not, you just say shasimcha b'mono and asher bara. Mishiva v'ad shloshim. Again, I told you a lot of comparisons to mourning from day 7 to day shloshim, which again, in mourning, there's also halachot that go for the first 7 days. There's halachot for the first day itself. The very first day, the day you do the burial, has a certain status with certain things about it. Then 7 days, then 30 days, and then a year, right? When you're talking about a parent. So, Mishiva Ba'ad Shloshim, here also, you have certain things that happen for the 7 days to the 30 days after the wedding. Bein Amar Lehu Machmari Lula, Bein Lo Amar Lehu Machmari Lula, if you have a meal, whether the meal is a celebratory meal relating to your wedding, or it's not, like you get together and you go out to dinner with some friends to celebrate the fact that you got married. So then it doesn't matter whether you did it that way, whether you did it not for the wedding, you say Hashasim Chabimono. But Ilo, Mikam Ve'elach, but once you're done with 30 days and beyond, we'll have to see in a minute how far beyond, although you can probably guess already, as I told you, it's set up like Avelut. From then on, if you're having a meal that's celebrating your wedding, then you do say Shasim Chabimono. But Ilo, many times you're going to have a meal or some sort of anything getting together with people that are not at all connected to your wedding, then you wouldn't say this introductory blessing in the zimun. Okay, you obviously don't say sheva brachot at that point. Right? You don't even say them after 7 days. So what's the end game here? To which the answer, okay, 12 months. Now they point out, even before, if we want to compare to Avelut, what do we have before? Onen, right? Before the burial, it's already leading toward the burial, right? You already, certain things kick in, right? There's also certain different things that are there. So from when? Amar Papa Michiramu Sare Be'asinta. When you put the barley beans up to soak, that's when it's already. When you start preparing the food, here, it's not just, okay, we're getting in the mode and you think, okay, right, you imagine a few days before the wedding, they start cooking the food, you're already in the celebratory mode, but it's really, we're going to see in a minute, it's because at that point we know, okay, we're worried more about the groom changing his mind and the groom's family rather than the bride's family usually, because again, the bride's always happy to get married, whereas the groom, might say, oh, maybe I'll choose someone else. Once they start preparing the food, remember the groom's family prepared the food. Once they prepare the food, they're clearly not changing their mind. So now we're going to have 2 stories about this that were a little different than what we just saw. So they ask, wait a minute. Rav Papa, he married off, right, shidduched off his son Abamar to some woman. Ubarich mishat erusin. Whenever during the engagement, it was all this happy time period, they would say Shasim Chabimono. So what do they answer? Shani Rav Papa Davatarachle. He already had prepared stuff for the wedding at that point, okay? And therefore he was not going back on it. Okay, what he prepared for the wedding so far in advance, I don't know. But the point is Rav Papa wasn't going to change. Like also he was confident that he wasn't changing his mind about it. Ravina married off his son, Be Rav Chaviva, to the house of Rav Chaviva. Ubarach Mishat Erusin, and he also did it from the time of the engagement. Amar Kimle Bigavayu Delo Hadrebu. He says, I know this family, and I know there's no way they're going to renege on this contract, right? They're going to marry. They're going to go through with the marriage for sure. Well, Lois Tayamilta, it didn't work out in the end. Vehadrebu, and in fact, Rav Chaviva changed his mind and unbetrothed his son to this woman, right? I guess he gave her a divorce. And in the end, it was kind of, saying things for no reason. And I think the Gemara is trying to tell you, you never really know what's going to happen and you shouldn't really do it until the food is actually prepared and, you're going ahead with it. But it was, kind of jarring about really knowing ever that things are, right? You think nowadays engagement doesn't really have any halachic ramifications. There really did. You think all the more so that they wouldn't renege on their promises. Okay, 1 second. Okay, next. Rav Chaviva Ikle Lebe Mahula. Interesting, we have a story. Oh, sorry, I skipped something. Rav Tachli Farber Ma'arava Ikle Lebavel. He gets to Bavel, Baruch Shit Arichata. The Leitel Chatakaveh. We're now going to have a whole bunch of different things that people did, and then we're going to say, but we don't paskin them. So he would say 6 longer brachot. Okay, he would add words to these brachot, right? Some of them are already a little bit long, some of them are short. He added on to them, so they were all long brachot, but we don't hold that way. Rav Chaviva Ikle Lebe Mahula, he went to a Brit Milah. Baruch Shasimcha B'mono. He said, oh, this is a celebratory occasion, right? We always think Shasimcha B'mono, to those of you who are familiar with it, that we say in the benching and the zimun, is all wedding related. But he said, no, you do it at a Brit Milah also. The Leitel Chatakavate Mishum Detride, Di'ile Tzara Liyanuka. A Brit Milah is fraught with worry and concern for the baby. There's pain for the child. So even though you're very happy, excited, bris of your child, but it's also, it's got some other things that take away somewhat from the simcha. And therefore you don't say that. But I wanted to point out, so people ask, what about Pidyon Ben, where you don't have any pain for the child, so maybe it's just simcha? There's a question about that. In the Sefer Minhagim, which is an Ashkenazi book from around the 1500s, I forget exactly when, but he talks about, which I thought was relevant to mention, that's siyum. When you're doing a siyum, some people say that maybe you're supposed, right, in the Sefer Minhagim, it says you're supposed to say Shasimcha b'mono because you're so excited that you're doing the siyum. It's unfortunate our Zoom siyums, you don't eat food. I hope you guys eat food at home and celebrate. That they say it's like a wedding celebration and that you should say Shasimcha b'mono when you do the bench. This is obviously only when you have 3 people, right? Zimun, proper zimun. Now we're going to move on to this 10. You need 10 people. So, Chatanim min haminyan. When you count 10, you can include the groom himself as part of the 10. Ve'en avelim min haminyan. But when it comes to avelut, you don't include 10. So now we're going to talk about what this 10 is. That's a good question. Is it 3 people or 10 people for simcha b'mono? I think it's only 3, but I don't remember the details. It's been a long time since I've said it. Someone can check that out. I forget. Okay. So now, usually it's just for Elokeinu. I think you might say some Shasim Chabimono even without 10, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on it. Someone can check. That would be great. Okay. So when you count the 10 for Avelim, we're going to have to see what are we counting 10 for Avelim for. Okay, we haven't gotten to anything about 10 for Avelim, but when you count the 10 for Avelim, the Avel himself is not included. Wait, we have a source that contradicts Rav. Chatanim ve'avelim min haminyan. So it's exactly both of them are part of the counting. Okay, so now, matnita karamet alei de Rav. Wait, why are you asking a question, Rav, from a Braita? I didn't read it right. Let me read it better. Matnita karamet alei de Rav. You're bringing a Mishnah to go against Rav or a Braita? Rav tanahu palig. Rav, okay, maybe you remember this, maybe you don't. Rav has status like a Tana and he can argue. Okay, there's rules in the Gemara. If you're an Amora, you can't disagree with the Tanaitic source unless you can somehow explain that the Tanaitic source works with you somehow. Or you can say, I hold by a different Tanaitic source. But you can't just go against an explicit Braita or a Mishnah without an explanation. However, Rav was in that generation that basically was the end of the Tanaitic time period, beginning of the Amoraic period. And he was a huge Talmid Chacham. He gets status. He can be considered like a Tana and he can go against a Braita. So don't bring that against him because you could just say Rav disagrees and that's a very easy answer. Now I say it's an easy answer. I want to point out that when we have a better answer, we answer a better answer. This is only a last resort. If they bring a contradiction against Rav from a Braita or a Mishnah, and there's a better way to explain it and say, oh, it's a machloka between Tanaim and he holds by that one, they always go with that first. But if they have no other choice, then they just say, oh, he's a Tana and he disagrees. Itma. Now it says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Chatanim min haminyan ve'en avelim min haminyan. Also, Rabbi Yitzchak said the name Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't have status to be arguing against the Tana. You could theoretically say maybe he'll like Rav, but they don't say that. So Meitiveh, they bring the same question. Chatanim ve'avelim min haminyan. They do count. So understand, Rabbi Yochanan, how did you say Avelim don't count as part of the 10 when it says in a Braita they do count? So turning now to Amabet, Gemara says, bebrakat hamazon. When you say that the Avel counts, that's in benching. Okay, in benching, he can be part of a zimun because he's chayav and mitzvot. He can count there. But when we're talking about, okay, well, we're going to have to see what else are we talking about. Okay, we're going to read right now. Kika Amar Rabbi Yochanan b'shura. When they made the shura, you need 10 people for that. And you need there, the Avel can't be part of the minyan, and it makes a lot of sense. Why? So first of all, what is a shura? It sounds similar to what we do today, although it's a little bit different. Right? Nowadays, we line up 2 rows of people. When the Avel leaves the cemetery, right? And they walk through the people, and the people say, so, or whatever you say. So here Rashi says, b'shura. When they would leave the kever, they would sit him down, and they would stand around him. So that's what they say. You need 10 for the shura, according to the Gemara in Sanhedrin. And they would be menachem right there at the kever. And that we don't count the avel, which makes perfect sense, because the whole idea is that they're supposed to be consoling the mourner. He's not part of their group. He's also an avel, right? Usually stand separate, right? It's different. But wait, if you want to say that he was talking about the shura, we have a problem with that. Why? Okay, that again, what does it mean? This 10 that you need is for the shura. Well, where basically they just console the avel. We're going to have another statement of his. You bless the blessings of the chatanim, which is the sheva brachot, in 10 people, right? With 10 people, and the chatanim count. And the bracha of the avelim, here's the important line, the blessings for the avel, which we haven't heard about yet, also you do with 10 people, and the avelim don't count as part of the minyan. So bracha b'shura mi'ika, you don't say the blessings of the avel when you do the shura, you just say divrei nechama, but you don't do that. So elachika amar Rabbi Yochanan b'rechava, must be in the rechava. Okay, here we have another thing. This was mentioned in Moed Katan, that when they would leave the cemetery, they would do what we call the Sudat Havra'ah, which is the meal after that you usually do at home. They would do it outside in a courtyard or something, and in a square. And there they would say the Birkat Avelim. They would say these blessings to the Avelim. So that must be what we're talking about. But that doesn't, in that you need 10 and the Avel doesn't count. So it's not the Shura, it's the Rechava. Now they say, but that also doesn't work with another statement of Rabbi Yitzchak in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, same thing we've seen. The blessing for the Avelim, you say all 7 days. That's already going to create a problem, because in the Rechava, you only do that once when you do the Sudat Havra'ah. So, so Birchat Rechava Kol Shiva Mi'ika, you don't have this bracha that you say in the Rechava all 7 days. No, you say the Birchat Avelim once. To which the Gemara says, not true. Mishkach ala b'panim chadashot. I told you we're going to have panim chadashot by Avelim. Just like the Birchat Chatanim, you say when you have a minyan and there's new people there. Also, the Birchat Avelim, you could say in the Shiva house. It seems like it's not probably happening in the Rechava anymore, but in the Shiva house, if new people come and you have 10 people, you can say these Birchat Avelim. Okay? What we do nowadays with Birchat Avelim, I tried to look up. I don't know enough about it. I don't think there is much left of it nowadays. I don't think we do this, but I could be wrong. I didn't have enough chance to really fully look into it, whether there's something of this still today. So maybe by tomorrow, I'll try to find time to look it up. So now we want to know where we get this idea of the Birkat Avelim and how you could do it with Panim Chadashot. We're going to see that Reish Lakish, or someone who worked for Reish Lakish, did it at someone's house. First, we're going to hear a story. Okay, people always talk about how, better to keep silent as much as you can in the Shiva house, because sometimes people say, or many times people say the wrong thing, right? Everybody who sits Shiva has those stories of the people who said things that were just not the right things to say at a Shiva house. So we're going to see that, although we will later come up with an explanation about why he said this. And it wasn't as bad as it sounded. Rav Chiya bar Abba mikre b'nei Reish Lakish. Rav Chiya bar Abba was the mikre. He was the teacher of Mikra, the Tanakh teacher of the sons of Reish Lakish. And Amrela, some people say he was matnei b'nei Reish Lakish. He was the Mishnah teacher of the sons of Reish Lakish. Either which way, he was their teacher. Shchiv leYanuka, his son died young, very young. Yom Akama lo azil l'gabei. The first day, Reish Lakish did not go visit him. Not sure why they're telling you this. Maybe it's to tell you, you should always go on the first day of Shiva. People say that often. Limachar, Davre Yehuda bar Nachmani Metorgamaneh. The next day, he said to his Yehuda bar Nachmani, who is Reish Lakish's Metorgaman, they're going to the Shiva house of Rav Chiya bar Abba, who's sitting Shiva for his young son. Amalei kum emamilta kol kabel Yanuka. He's like his spokesperson. So he says to his spokesperson, go say something, to lenachem oto, right, to make him feel better, to console him. Patach v'amal. He says the following pasuk: Vayar Hashem vayinatz mikas banav ubnotav. God saw, and maybe someone can help me with the exact translation of vayinatz. Help me in the chat, but he got very upset, or I don't know someone could say the word. Anyway, I'll finish the pasuk and then go back to it. Abhorred, okay. God saw and abhorred mikas banav ubnotav, the anger of his sons and daughters. So how does he translate this? The Meturgaman, he says, Dor she'avot minatzim lakadosh baruch hu, the generation where the fathers are abhorred to God, or someone else how he was provoked to God, okay, acted in a provocative manner, okay, did something bad. God then gets angry at their sons and their daughters, and they die young. Okay, basically, I see you're saying provoked his anger. Okay, thank you. So now we're gonna, right? So basically, this is the great, right? Not the smartest thing to say in a shiva house if someone lost a young child. Oh, you obviously did something terribly wrong, and because of that, God punished in this way. Some people say it was a little different, not much better. He was a little older than a young child. What's the relevance? We'll see in a minute. What he said was this. Again, it's just quoting different verses. God is not pleased with his bachurim, with his lads, young lads. He will not have pity on the orphans and the widows. Because he's a total hypocrite. Umera, and evil. And he speaks bad things. He has bad language, foul language. Despite that, right, or on account of that, God's anger didn't subside, and his hand is still outstretched. What is this? Or really, they're explaining what's this also, because the choped dover nevala, this is just an aside. Basically, before we even get to this, God is saying, he did obviously bad things, the child, not you, but the child. So now, so what's this od yadon netuya? My od yadon netuya. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rav. Hakol yodim kala lama nechnasa l'chuppah. Everybody knows what, not why she's going to the chuppah, but basically, right? They're going to the chuppah. Obviously, we know what's going to happen that night. Okay, we've been talking about it for a bunch of tapim in the beginning of Ketubot. It's actually funny because it's pretty out there in this Masechet, and yet the Gemara tells you, right? Ella. Right? If you start talking about what's going to happen the first night and what the couple is doing, even if you're supposed to have 70 good years, you will be punished and it will all switch to bad, meaning you shouldn't discuss what you know is happening behind closed doors right after they get married. It's not appropriate. That's just an aside, although it does connect with our Masechet and the fact that we're discussing what goes on behind closed doors, and yet they're saying, well, do it, carefully. So now the Gemara obviously says, I don't get what's going on here. He came to console him. But he's making it much, much worse. Right? This is definitely a no-no to go into a shiva house like that and start talking in that way. This is what he meant. What he was saying is, you are from such a prominent, important family that your son is getting punished for the sins of the generation. The people, not you, not your sins, but the people's sins, and not, according to the second pasuk, not your son's sins, but the young lads of the generation, he's getting punished for that. And that's because you're an important, prominent person. That was the idea of consoling. I don't know if it makes them feel better, but it's definitely not the way it sounded, according to the way they explained it. In any case, why are we bringing this? Because we wanted to get to these brachot avelim, that when new panim come to the house, you can say brachot avelim. Amarle. So Reish Lakish turns to his Meturgaman and says, go praise God. Patach v'amar. Now we're going to see brachot avelim, just like sheva brachot. Each one is kind of for a different purpose. Here also the brachot avelim, each one is designated toward a different person that we want to praise, very similar to what we saw, or at least similar to the fact that in the brachot chatanim, we have one for the whole community of people who gathered. We have for the creation of people, of humans, that we have for the chatan and kala. Anyway, and really they're praising God. So here also, we start with praise of God. Okay, God is so great and grand, right? It sounds like the beginning of Shmona Esrei, right? A combination of the first two brachot. He's so great, he's so strong. Right? He brings people back from the dead. Reasonable that we should say this now. Right? There's no, you can't even measure them. And right, they can't be numbered. These are the wondrous things he does. God brings back the dead, resurrects the dead. So now he says, okay, now say something about the avelim, people mourning. Our brothers who are who are suffering and depressed about this terrible thing, go into your hearts and start thinking about how you can be a better person, right? It's one of the responses, also talking about Rosh Hashanah, right? He also talks about this. Should be our response. Not why did this happen, but what can I do to make myself a better person? This is something that's been forever, and it will be forever. Nativu mishesh yimei breshit, right? Started from the 6 days of creation. Rabim shatu, rabim yishtu. Many people drank. Okay, what's this? Drank in the Nevi'im. The prophets always talks about this kos hatarela, right? The kos hapuranut, right? They drank this, meaning they drank. Right there, they've gotten punishment. Rabim yishtu, and many people will have this in the future and will get punished and die. Just like happened in the celebrations of them. Also, right, mishteh again is referring to the shtiyah, the drinking of this kos puranut. Right, this will happen in the future. Right, the God who is the God of consolation, He will console you. Baruch menachem avelim. Okay, let the mourners be consoled. Abai doesn't like this language. Rabim shatu lema, rabim yishtu lo lema. You can talk about the past, but don't start saying people will drink this in the future. Mishteh rishonim lema, talk about the past, but mishteh achronim lo lema, don't start talking about the future. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, v'chein tana mishmei Rabbi Yossi, lo lama yiftach peh, al yiftach adam piv l'satan. This is something people always say, right? Don't open up your mouth. Don't suggest, the power of suggestion, right? Don't say it. Don't put into words what we don't want to happen. I'm Rav Yosef, Mikra. Where do you see this in a pasuk? Because it says, "Kistom hayinu la'amora daminu." We were like the people of Stom and Amorah, right? Who were terrible people. Maya hadole. What's the response to this? Shemut v'Hashem tzine Stom, and it says Am Amorah. In other words, first we say we were like them, and then we get called the nation of Stom and the nation of Amorah. In other words, because we suggested it, so then God used it against us. Amrle kum ema milta keneged minachamei avelim. So we have praise of God. We have consoling the Avelim. Now we say, what about the people who came to console them? They get blessed as well, just like at the wedding. Patach v'amar, achenu gomlei chasadim b'nei gomlei chasadim. You do chesed, who are the sons of those who do chesed, obviously we were going to mention. Hamachzikim b'brito shel Avram Avinu, he was always known as the gomel chesed. Achenu ba'al hagmul yishalem v'chen gmulchem, right? God is the one who gives out the reward. He will give you your reward. Baruch et Hashem shalem hagmul. Amalei. Now say a blessing for all the Jewish people, even the ones not here. Okay, go save the Jewish people. Right, from the plagues, sword, from enemies, from the shidafon, from the land drying out, from the yerakon, right? These are two things that can happen to all the fields and all the foods will be wiped out. And all terrible things that could happen. Right before I call, you'll immediately answer. May you stop the plague. Okay, apropos our corona situation. Okay, so those are the 4 themes of the brachot avelim for all those different people. Amar Ula, now we have something very strange. I'll finish with this for today. They said you should drink 10 cups of wine. Well, I think 4 cups is a lot for Pesach night. 10 cups of wine. And you think that's a lot, just wait. So why 10? 3 before to kind of get your stomach ready for the food. So that your food settles. 4 one for each blessing of Birkat Hamazon. They added another 4. For the people who dealt with the burial, like the Chevra Kadisha. Those who fund the Chevra Kadisha for the people who can't afford their own burial. Rabban Gamliel. One for the temple, that it be rebuilt, and one for Rabban Gamliel. Why Rabban Gamliel? So first, before we get to Rabban Gamliel, okay, so 14 cups of wine. But then people got way drunk. So they returned it to the way it was originally. That's a big debate. What is originally? Originally, they went 10 to 14, then they went back to 10. That's what Rashi says. Some people say, no, 10 also gets you drunk. Originally means no, just going back to drinking normally. I want to point out one thing. I know we're running late, but it's really interesting. Many people think that you're not allowed to have wine when you're in Avel, and they think this because in the 9 days, which is like Avelut, you're not allowed to drink wine. But it's totally not true, and you see from here that it's not true. And if you look in the Torah in Or Chaim, Taf Kuf Nun Bet, Siman Taf Kuf Nun Bet, where it's talking about the 9 days, it explains, and I'm going to read it from there. They say that's why wine was created, to help console mourners. You should drink wine because the whole idea is to try to console yourselves. To forget a little bit of your pain. But what about the 9 days? Why is it forbidden? We're going to forget about it. There's a big difference between avelut and the 9 days. Avelut, we want to get you from feeling this terrible pain to feeling it less. In the 9 days, we want to do the opposite. We want you to feel the pain. It's harder for you to feel the pain. We don't want you drinking any wine so that you really actually feel the pain. Okay, we're left with one thing here. My Rabban Gamliel. What is this thing with Rabban Gamliel? Why did they make a bracha just for him on a cup of wine? The cost of burying people, and not because of the burial itself. Nowadays, it's the cost of burial. But then it was the cost of the burial shrouds was so expensive that people sometimes just left the dead body and ran. They're like, I'm not dealing with my dead relative. I can't afford it. So Achabar Rabban Gamliel, who remember was very wealthy. And in the story of Rabbi Yoshua, he didn't understand the poor people. In this story, he clearly understood it. It was clearly the end of his life. He said, when I die, I want you to put me in the simplest garments, in flax garments. Okay? Burial shrouds. Everybody did like him, and he basically saved the people. And he basically made it equality for everyone. Nowadays, people bury in the simplest canvas, not even linen, flax, but even something much simpler, and everyone's buried in the same thing. And it keeps this issue of equality a very beautiful way to end the daf. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a great day, everyone.